Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Stockholm.
Welcome to Sweden and Svensk Tidskrift. My name is Ydstedt and I'm the chairman of Svensk Tidskrift, a foundation and a weekly political magazine. Svensk Tidskrift was founded in 1911 by two famous Swedish economists, Gösta Bagge, a conservative, and Elia Fächer, a liberal. Today, 110 years later, we preserve the legacy as a liberal conservative voice. Svensk Tidskrift shows the way for individual freedom, free markets, the rule of law and democracy since 1911. In 2020, we published more than 350 essays on politics, economy and culture. We arrange seminars and we publish books on current issues. All our articles are available in our free online archive. We're also very happy to be a part of a network of international friends, such as Free Market Roadshow and the European Resource Bank. Welcome to Svensk Tidskrift.
Hello and welcome to Svensk Tidskrift. Today we will have an interesting discussion about what we learned from 1989 and reforms from that time. But first we will listen to my friend Professor Krassen Stanchev from Sofia in Bulgaria, who will talk a little bit about his reflection on what happened since 1989 and what we learned about regulation and what could be better and what is perhaps the threats to the development today. So please, Krassen Stanchev.
Hello, my name is Krassen Stanchev. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and I'm supposed to speak on what we have forgotten since 1989 in terms of regulation and in unintended consequences. I don't like speaking on behalf of we, but this time I will make an exception because it's Kakha's Bendukidze's birthday. I think that we in Europe, and especially the European Union, are missing at the moment Georgia's example and Kakha Bendukidze's sense of mission in what has been done in Georgia after 2003-2004. I will mention several phenomena which are somehow forgotten as or restore forgotten phenomena from the times before '89. And the first phenomenon is the growing trust in the government. It has not been always like this. The growing trust in the government was somehow set forward relatively recently, probably in the last 10 years, to some extent after the adoption of the euro. Let's look at the names of different public positions in the European Union, or the names of political parties in the European Parliament, or the names of the directorates or the titles of different European Union programs. So, for example, the European Union has a minister from Lithuania, has a minister which is responsible for the economy that works for the people. He has about 16 competencies, which is a limbo of everything, from supporting small and medium enterprises through Euroland policies, Eurozone policies, including the Central Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank, trade and investment, and of course I will quote here, climate, environmental and labor protections, plus the welfare state. So the very title, economy that works for the people, rings the bell or creates, a memory, or brings the memory of Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 slogan of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that his government will be working in order to create everything in the name of the man, and all for the good of the man. Then we had a joke, because the slogan was taken by other communist countries and their governments, and then we had a joke. Yes, we even know who is the man. If you look at the names of the EU directorates, they are basically similar. They intend to say something good for the people. At the same time, they distrust the people, on which I will be talking later. More important are probably even the names of the parties. Besides, some classical names like People's Party or the Socialist, most classic and new parties in the European Parliament have names you would not recognize, especially as names of the factions of the Parliament. For example, my beloved European liberals are calling themselves now Renew Europe Coalition. So to me they sound like renewables. At least they never questioned the Green Deal, which is part of the plan of the European Union transfers for the next 7 or more even years. So let's go now to the programs. So just 2 examples. One of the key programs, all of them are with a vast amount of money. One of the key programs is called Next Generation EU COVID-19 Recovery Package, or the Just Transition Mechanism, making sure no one is left behind. When you read all the second especially, you would never understand that the just transition means closing coal power plants and substitute their fuel with natural gas, which basically means a hidden subsidy to the import of natural gas from Russia by Gazprom, which is about 45% of the consumption of gas in the European Union. For some countries it's even more. For Bulgaria it's 98% of the gas, of the natural gas consumed by the economy. The next phenomenon is the investing state. Before '89, the government was responsible for 98% of the investment. The money was lottery tickets because of the shortages. Whatever you find in the shops, you buy it, be these bananas or toilet papers. What we are seeing now is some sort of a re-emergence of this investment state. This is not in the form we used to have it, but the plan of the European Union plus the European Central Bank for the next 7 years is about 17% of the European Union's GDP for this year, which basically means that there will be a crowding out effect of this investment state on private investment and private initiatives. Everybody remembers Hayek, who used to repeat that the more the government plans, the less the private enterprises plan. We managed to dismantle all this immediately after '89. Now it is coming back. The difference is there. This is not complete repetition of what we had as a reality before '89, but if we then have more than 90% of GDP distributed and planned by the governments, now we have about 20%. The problem now is that the decision of this 20% is very difficult to control. There are different layers of decision making in the European Union. The second thing is that this is not a ban or a prohibition on the private investment, which was the case before '89, But this is a heavy regulation on the private sector, and in a sense it's a regulatory socialism created by the European Union with the consent of the member states, or their governments which sit in the Council of the European Union. All this is very different from what we had before. Some countries like Georgia, after 2003, or the Baltic states and Poland, at the beginning of the 90s, it took about 3 years to dismantle the regulatory socialism, or the regulatory side of the socialism. I remember working for the World Bank in Kyrgyzstan. We had to deal away with regulations of the tourism industry. And only on tour operators there were about 217 regulations, and the hotels, there were about 240 regulations on the hotels, including, what people eat, how they sleep, and to whom they talk in the hotels. So some countries were not that successful as Georgia or the Baltic states or Poland eventually, because the Bendukidzes were voted out. They failed in elections, and these were one of the causes of the political transition, so to say, of the democratic transition. The next thing which is very important and related to this is the fact that in order to have the cash to subsidize 17% of the economy, be this bailing out countries or bailing out industries, the Union itself, the Commission, needs to have its own source of revenue. The debates on the new sources of revenue for the European Commission, which are now limited to 1%, are going for already 2 years, and they will reach, these new sources of revenue will reach 8% of the European Union GDP, which is basically 8% of 17 trillion euros. This is a lot of money. So the member states should agree by the end of this month on the new sources of revenue. There will be delays, no question about this. But eventually, what is happening at the moment is that the European Union is bribing the governments, the incumbent governments of the member states, to stay in the Union and to agree on this. And the bribe has a very exact figure for each country. The membership fee of every member of the European Union is reduced by 20%. But at the same time, in order to have this lesser payment to the Union, they are promised large sums of money through at least these two, but there are many other lines of fiscal subsidies from the Union. This has another dimension. The sources of revenue, the own sources of revenue for the European Commission are carbon taxes, so it's related to the Green Deal somehow. Unified tax base within the European Union, and the directive, which is to be discussed in the next 4 years, the directive of the European minimum wage. This is a common manner of designing the minimum wage, which basically leads to no competition on the tax base, leads no competition on taxes, no competition on wages, no competition on welfare policies, which basically will end up with lesser competition of each and every country of the European, each and every economy of the European Union, and the entire European Union economy. And more such regulations in the pipeline. So this year the countries shall consent to these three sources of revenue. Probably, in the next couple of years there will be new things discussed as a source of revenue, and probably larger opportunity for the Commission to borrow. Last but not least, the European Central Bank, as part of this policy package, had forgotten the basic principles of central banking, which were with us since the end of the World War II, and which were restored in different forms in the countries of the former communist camp. and that the core principle of central banking after the World War II was maintaining the price stability. Now the European Central Bank will be subsidizing competitive industries. It will be financing the Green Deal or the climate change policies. It will be bailing out countries, and it is already bailing out countries, and it will be bailing out banks. It is already happening. So eventually this is a new central bank, and the difference between the Commission and the central bank is basically next to zero. So a Commission is basically influencing the central bank of the European Union. There are three probable outcomes. The Union will borrow in its own name, and it will become the largest credit of last resort. Members of the governments of the member states are in fact invited to agree with everything which is done within the Union. And last but not least, the voters of the European Union have no option for effective negative legitimacy, negative opinion. They can say no to some politicians or to some policies they dislike on national level. But when they say this no to the European Union, it is mixed with everything else, and there is no effect of this negative legitimacy on the European Union level. The third phenomenon is the so-called servile state. Those who are knowledgeable in the philosophy of government, the philosophy of politics, and public choice theory, they know what is a servile state. But servile state is a state or the government which is a credit of last resort. This is a government which expects from the subjects in its jurisdiction to behave accordingly in order to subsidize them, in order to give them a contract, in order to give them a credit, or to bail out them. People and companies who disagree will not be subsidized, so they lose competitiveness. I have a friend in Bulgaria who is actually a Swiss Bulgarian who invested in the wine industry, and when he expressed an opinion towards the government and when he subsidized finance with his own cash one political party, the government just stopped subsidies for his vineyards. So currently he is 6 million euro a year behind all the competition. So all this creates some sort of a Bastia state. Those who had read Frederick Bastiat, they know that his definition of state is that it is a fictitious entity through which everybody is trying to live at the expense of somebody else with the help of the government. This is actually happening at the moment. Then the next thing in the servile state is that the government is not trusting the people. They think that the people cannot do by their own, they cannot resolve problems by their own, and the government dislikes what people eat, what people drink, what people smoke, what people puff, if you look at the nanny-state index. But also the government may not like how people dress, what they speak, how they think, and how they behave. And this is very similar to what we have been witnessing in the history of this part of the world, in the period between the wars and after the wars in the so-called socialist camp. The fourth phenomenon is the end of the world and the new designs of new environmental policies. So during the COVID-19, at the beginning, suddenly everybody had forgotten that, according to some popular individuals, the main killer of the world is the climate change. So if you look at the background, our countries were one of the major pollutants in the Northern Hemisphere. So I know the case of Bulgaria. As an environmental committee chairman of the Constitutional Assembly of Bulgaria at the beginning of the 90s, I had to close 5 most polluting in the world factories which were producing lead, zinc, copper, gold and silver. I closed one of those. We privatized all of them. Now all these 5 factories are the best in Europe, and one of them is even best in the world in terms of technology to produce gold. Similarly is the story of all other countries. The major popularity of environmental agenda at the end of the 80s was that the environment agenda did not need a special proof that the communist regime is anti-human. So for this reason, most of the opposition, or important opposition to the communist regime, went through the environment. So the idea of those who were involved in the environmental reform policies at the beginning of the 90s, we had one very simple idea. Leave the economy work, privatize the polluting industries, punish those who pollute, but do not hold responsible the new owners for the past environmental liabilities. And that's how we managed. If you look at the Yale University Environmental Performance Index, our countries are among the best 30 countries in the world in terms of environmental performance. We are much cleaner than we used to be. So at the same time, the European Union is setting the agenda of the so-called Green Deal, which, as I said, is just a policy which will be subsidizing imports of natural resources from, for example, Russia. And it will make no difference globally because the pollution share of the European Union is the very minimum. The last thing I would like to mention is the trap of the risk-free society. COVID-19, 2020 and the beginning of this year had created the belief, or had somehow reinforced the political delusion that the societies may be risk-free and the economies may be risk-free, no bankruptcies, no dynamics between poor and rich, and so on and so forth. So this is of course impossible, but this is how our politicians are being created. They're being elected. They're elected because they promise a risk-free society. So this, from a historic perspective, is one of the greatest challenges. What we have, or we used to have, what we have now is very similar to what we used to have before '89. Then the promise was that there will be no difference between rich and poor, and there will be no risk in the society, and everything will be in the name of the man, and everything will be for the good of the man. So this did not happen. Something of the sort is being repeated now. Such states cannot exist in a representative democracy, but in a representative democracy, the governments and politicians do promise that they will create such risk-free society or risk-free economy. And this is how they bribe the electorate. So if I think of Kakha Bendukidze's legacies, of Balcerovic's legacies, of what we in most of our countries were doing at the beginning of the 90s and in the Balkans at the beginning of this century, because ex-Yugoslav countries, they suffered a war between themselves. So what we've managed to accomplish was just because we trusted the individual spirit, we trusted the individual dignity, we trusted private sector, and we trusted market-based decisions, and we managed to dismantle the regulatory side of the socialism, because the other side was dismantled by itself before 89. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Stanchev. That was a really harsh message, I think, about the current development in the European Union. And are the politicians promising too much when they promise a risk-free society and perhaps not trusting the market economy anymore? I think that's my main take from your presentation. We have a very distinguished panel to discuss this today. We have Margareta Cederfelt. She's a member of the parliament, of the Swedish parliament, and she's also going around the world and look into how elections are done and control them and report if there are any irregularities. And I hope that she will talk a little bit about the current status of democracy in countries. Is there this development that Professor Krassen Stanchev talked about? Then we have Professor Nils Karlson from Ratio Institute in Stockholm, and he is an expert on liberal reforms, how they are done. How's the status of liberal reforms in Europe? Can you agree with what Professor Stanchev told us? And last and not least, we have Dr. Mats Kinnwall. He is a chief economist of the Swedish mechanic. Now I forgot the name, but the organization for industries in Sweden, and he has probably interesting perspective on the industry. Give us the industry perspective on this development and how programs are done in the European Union. So first, Margareta, please, how is the status for democracy? Have we forgotten something from 1989, or how is the development?
Thank you very much, Anders, and thank you for giving me the floor. Yes, I'm Margareta Cederfelt, member of the Swedish Parliament from the Moderator Party and Vice President of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And OSCE is a security organization, but it looks on security in a very wide perspective, including, of course, the military arena, but also democracy, human rights perspective. And OSCE observes quite a lot of elections in the OSCE area, and the OSCE countries are from Mongolia in east to US, Canada in west. And what I could say in my perspective is that democracy, rule of law, transparency, corruption, trust, all this goes together. If there is a system like those in the former Soviet Union with the former communist countries, there was on the paper democracy, but everybody who lived in the countries, they knows that this was just a paper, it was fake. All the rest of the world didn't know the same. We did know, and we could still see it, that those countries have a lack in economic growth. We could also see that rule of law, it was out of order, and it's still a huge problem. We could see that the level of corruption was very high, and it's still high. We could see that the trust from people, from the society, from the government, again towards the people, it was nada. We could see the same, that the people didn't trust the politicians or the system at all. This was during the communist time, but it's still there because what that system did to the society, it's still relevant. It still affects the society, and therefore I see democracy as one of the most important issues for today. And when we observe election, it's not only to see how is the E-Day observed, performed. It's also how is the system, what's happened before, what's happened during the E-Day, what happened afterwards, because all this goes together. And I am more and more convinced that if it should be a society open for people, open for growth, open for everybody to be respected, there need to be market economy. But market economy, it's not something that's fit in a totalitarian regime. It goes hand in hand with democracy and market economy. And that's also a reason to really work for democracy, work for the market economy. I have been in so many countries where the leaders have said, we have our system of democracy. But when I mean that, it's no private companies, it's less private news, it's restrictions of the fundamental freedoms. And also, when it comes to this, they say they will have their own form of market economy. But I haven't so far heard anybody explaining, any responsible politicians explaining, what do they mean by this? I don't see it. So I could just underline what Professor said. It's market economy is a garant for freedom, but we need, as politicians, to defend the fundamentals for market economy. And one important issue is democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margareta. And interesting that market economy and democracy is working together, or is dependent on each other. You write sometimes in Svensk Tidskrift about the different elections that you follow, and I'm interested to see that you sometimes write about freedom of press. That's also a part of democracy, and that's at stake in some elections, that the ruling party don't allow the opposition to use media in the same way as to control the ruling party. Could you perhaps say something about that?
Yes, I could say it's true. What I have noticed in quite a lot of countries, that's the elections are not free, the elections are not transparent, they are not performed the democratic way. It means that the base for a divided political landscape with different parties, where citizens have the possibility to be members or not to be members, just to stand out and make their own choice. In those countries where there is a lack of democracy, I could see that the media is run by the governmental body. The media is owned by the governmental body. And what I always say, it's that we want to have quality. We are really looking forward to have high standard. It shouldn't be any fake news. People should rely on this. But with the internet, in a free country, people, I mean, in those countries where the media is owned by the government, it's not free, it's very strange reporting. People don't read, they don't trust the governmental media, so they check on internet. And that's why internet is locked down in several countries. I have seen it so often that it's not only journalists who are put in jail, it's also locked down on internet. It's people who use internet to produce their own news or to be active on Twitter or things like that, who are put in jail. The most famous case these days, it's, for example, Boris Navalny, who is in jail in Russia, but we could see a similar situation in Belarus. And one thing I have noticed in quite a lot of countries with where the media is, it's not a free media, is that, for example, when it comes to election, they say all parties, all candidates have the right to free time in media. They have the right for 5 minutes during the election campaign to be in media. But then the 5 minutes is divided, that the regime, the government, they get all the good times. Then the opposition party, if there is an opposition, they have 5 minutes, 5 minutes past 12 in the middle of the night or 5 o'clock in the morning, because that's the slot they are giving. And it's the regime who control this. Or maybe one more case I would like to say, when it's election, there might be a regulation that says the day before the E-Day, it should be the silent day, when people could think about the election, how do they want to vote for? No campaign. No, there is no campaign. That's correct. If you don't say that when the governmental persons go out and open schools, visit the healthcare, the home for old age people, and it's all over the governmental media, owned media, isn't that campaign? They define it as information.
Yeah.
So I mean, if it's a totalitarian regime, they do what they want. Thank you.
Thank you, Cederfelt. Yeah, interesting perspective. We go on with Professor Nils Karlson. You're a professor and really perhaps the most famous expert on liberal reforms. What's your take on Professor Krassen Stanchev's view on the current status?
I've actually been quite involved in discussion about the future of the EU as well, and I'm just as concerned as Krassen Stanchev, actually. I think we have a huge problem here with the developments in the European Union. Let me make a parallel, to Sweden in the 70s and 80s. Sweden had the famous welfare state, with very high levels of redistribution, very high taxes on individuals, on income, but also on firms, confiscatory taxes actually on firms. And that had very serious and negative consequences for the Swedish economy. In fact, Sweden was stagnating. We have stagflation, as you said, back then, from 1970 to 1990, more or less. Then Sweden started a reform process where we liberalized, deregulated the economy, lowered the taxes in many ways, and Sweden is functioning a lot better today than it did back in those bad, terrible days, actually. Now, what's happening in the EU is quite similar to what happened in the 70s in Sweden, I think. There are all kinds of politicians, all kinds of interests, trying to promote, of course, as Stanchev said, trying to use a language saying that we're all benevolent, we're all supporting good purposes, and we want all these regulations, we want all these subsidies, we want all these interventions into markets, into civil society, in order to promote the good society, in a sense, But what they forget is that the good society, and I think that's the main liberal vision, actually, is what Margareta has told about. It's the rule of law, it's constitutional democracy, and it's limited government. So what we do want, and that's the reason I still support the EU, we do want the rule of law. We want open markets, we want secure property rights. And for Sweden, we joined the EU in 1995. The EU has been very positive for Sweden so far, I think. It has opened up a huge market, 500 million people, huge possibilities for individuals, huge possibilities for companies. It has promoted productivity, growth, prosperity in Sweden. I'm very convinced about this. But what we've seen in the last few years is very problematic. First, in the global financial crisis and the debt crisis, that occurred in 2009, 10 and so on, with Greece, Portugal, Spain, and some other countries. The ECB did not really follow the basic agreements, the constitution, if you want, of the EU, and started to save banks, to do things that they weren't at all supposed to do. And we let this happen, unfortunately. And now with the COVID crisis, it's become even worse. I think we should be very critical to the so-called recovery package, which is loan financed, as Krachev mentioned here, and all kinds of rules that state subsidies for firms and so on, that's forgotten. We have this new industrial policy. I don't think Krassen mentioned that, but I'm sure that we will hear more about that from Kinnwall later, so I won't talk about that, but it's highly problematic. So the politicians, combinations of the parliament, the commission, but also the council actually. Also the national government support this for strange reasons. We started to destroy, in fact, the open market, the internal market, the limited role that I think the EU should have and have been very good at promoting so far. So what's the solution? To come back to the reforms. In Sweden, it took a long struggle, and I've studied Sweden thoroughly, but I've done a book called Statecraft and Liberal Reforms in Advanced Democracies, where I compare with Australia, and I propose a general theory of how to promote reforms. And the key is, of course, to promote liberal ideas. In the long run, ideas is what matters. And the wrong ideas are out there, and we have to take this fight. And these ideas has to be supported by strong resources, and those resources have to come from private sector, you know. So I think we have done a bad job concerning the EU for the last 20 years or so, and we have to start to work a lot harder on how to promote the good development in the EU. And we have to raise resources for this. Otherwise, we will have a very problematic development where, as I said, something similar to the big Swedish dysfunctional welfare state may be produced at the European level here in the coming years. And that would be very, very problematic. So I think I stop there and be happy to take part of the discussion instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nils. Better ideas, more resources for better ideas. I understand your message, Manar. We come back with questions, and there's also possibility for a chat, I think, on people looking at this on the web. Dr. Mats Kinnwall, he's the chief economist at the Association of Swedish Engineering Industry. So now we will have the industry perspective and perhaps something about the European Union industrial policy. Please, Dr. Kinnwall.
Thank you for the invitation and an interesting session, definitely. I was thinking about, I made a reflection, looking back to 1989, that was the starting point of the presidential address here, so to speak. And it's interesting to study the narrative, as we used to say these days, because these decades have been a fundamental and fantastic success story when it comes to economic growth all over the world. I mean, it's been a giant economic leap for mankind during these decades, and especially people in the poorer countries, they have been experiencing a lift to economic welfare that has never happened in the history of mankind. And this, I think, is to a large extent a consequence of globalization and more market deregulation. There have been other factors as well that have contributed to this success story. But anyway, I think globalization and liberalization markets have been two important factors. And still nowadays, especially in Europe, in the Eurozone, politicians and the EU Commission are pushing for some kind of state capitalism and rolling back the market economy. It's some kind of paradox that is a little bit hard to understand. Maybe it's a reflection of some kind of complex attitude towards China, because China has been growing even much stronger than the rest of the world, and the story, the narrative here is that that's because China has been very successful with their state capitalism agenda. I don't agree on that. We wrote a debate article in one of the Swedish papers a few months ago. So I think, but it's more like it's more a consequence of a long period of catch up than a consequence of successful economic and social policies in China. But anyway, I think many in Europe have bought into the story of the Chinese success story with the state capitalism agenda. And since the Eurozone has been the laggard for quite a while in terms of economic policies, they have been looking for other strategies that they hope will fulfill the vision of making the Eurozone the EU the most productive and creative economic region in the world. I'm quite convinced that the new industrial agenda will definitely not contribute to making Europe the most productive and creative economic zone, because I think they're moving in the wrong direction. I don't think that state capitalism is the answer to low productivity growth and the way to move Europe into a period of strong productivity growth. Actually, the other way around, because they are. I don't have the time to go into the details, but the idea is that politicians, the EU Commission, and so on and so forth, they will pinpoint future strategic and technological so to speak, growth areas, and allocate huge public funds to create big companies in those areas, and that will be able to compete with, for instance, huge Chinese and American champions. I don't think politicians are the best. Their best. They're not. Their competence is not in creative growth. They can erase obstacles to growth by allowing the market economy to function efficiently. But I don't think that their role is to pinpoint future champions. But I think this is partly a reflection of this idea that China has been a success story. But I think that this will actually work in the opposite direction. And we should remember the Swedish industry, manufacturing, the biggest market for Swedish exporters is, of course, the Eurozone, and we are part of the EU, and we're part of EU. So Swedish manufacturing and Swedish industry is dependent on an efficiently working European Union, of course. And moreover, since Sweden has to adopt basically the same agenda as the rest of the EU, this kind of political intervention in the market economy will also happen in Sweden. So a less efficient European Union is bad news for Swedish industry, and we have to some extent in Sweden do the same as the rest of the EU, and that will also hamper productivity growth and productivity growth in the Swedish industry. So I think there are lots of details and parts of the industrial agenda that I think are very counterproductive for for EU and for Sweden, particularly because many of many ingredients in the agenda will benefit huge German and French, particularly maybe German, but also French manufacturers on the expense of smaller and medium-sized Swedish companies. So I think the agenda is something that primarily will benefit the big countries, especially in Germany, but also to some extent France, and be a negative for smaller countries with small and medium, primarily small and medium-sized companies. So in that's why we really are not in favor, or no friends of the new industrial agenda in the EU. Basically, I think I stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mats. May I ask you? I borrow the last sentence from Nils that we are lacking, perhaps looking for better. We need better ideas. Have we been tired of the ideas of 1989 and looking for China as something new, or do politicians, is that a normal state to prefer regulation before deregulation, or what's your view?
Well,
How can we get better ideas in the market, political market?
you want me to?
Yeah.
Well, I'll start then.
Yeah,
Okay.
perhaps Nils.
I think we thought we had won. That's always dangerous. We thought that the free markets and the open society had won, but what we've seen. To come back to the question of democracy, I mean, if you look at the indexes that exist, it's been a backlash here for the last 16 years, actually, from Freedom House and those kinds of indexes. When it comes to economic freedom, it's the improvements have stopped. So the curve has flattened. So for many countries, we increased economic freedom for many years, but that improvement has stopped over the last 10 years or so. And we thought we had won, but you never win. We have to take these fights all the time. And the world changes, of course, with China, with new technologies, with all kinds of environmental challenges and so on. So I think that's it. And I think a major message for me is that ideas is not enough. Statecraft needs ideas. Liberal statecrafts need liberal ideas, of course, but you also need good politicians, like the ones you have, a few you have, and we have to support them. And good people have to engage in politics to do the job. Otherwise, the bad guys will win. And the bad guys are not only communists, all kinds of special interests, all kinds of industries in the big countries, perhaps, as Matt says, that wants regulations, that wants subsidies. It's very tempting to use the state to promote your own interests. And the bigger the state becomes, or the bigger the EU becomes, for example, we haven't mentioned that, but the social pillar, it's very, very dangerous, more dangerous than industrial policies, I think, This will attract more interests,
May I ask you both, Nils and Mats, about Margareta told us about how democracy and market economy works together. Can you say something about that?
I think, state capitalism, we've seen that in combination with the dictatorship. I mean, we had China and Singapore, perhaps, and whatever how we define Singapore. But anyway, so I think it's very hard to really combine really free markets and market economy with a dictatorship, I think, or with a authoritarian regime. I think that's a good point. Just let me add another thing. I think that there's been creating a strange coalition in Europe. German conservatives and French socialists, if you like, they have come together and they agree on this idea of building huge German and French companies from completely different perspectives. I think the Germans, they by softening the competitive rules, etc., they get the chance to take over the European economy, so to speak. And we know in France they have this these planning ideas and ambitions for decades. So they unite from different directions in a common policy that is, I think, very destructive for the European Union and for Sweden, as I said, due to our different structure when it comes to the business sector and the industrial sector.
So we have got some questions from the audience here also. How to get good ideas into politics and the politicians, people with ideas to get more involved in politics. Perhaps Margareta could say something about that.
Yes, I could try to say, first of all, I wish I could really say something, because then it would also look different in Sweden, of course, and in most of the European countries. But I believe very strongly in ideas. And I think that's, to get good politicians, they need to be value-based. Otherwise, I mean, if you have another dream, then be value-based, just to, what should I say, to make yourself rich, or to close the society, or to defend the space of power for yourself, then it will never be politicians who work for the free society and for other people's growth. And for me, it goes together, because if a free society where people can grow, where people can make money, but where people could live their own choice of life, doesn't matter what kind of life they want to live, as long as they are not making violence against somebody else. It's a society where there is a rule of law, where you can put demand on politicians, where there are scrutinizing possibilities to scrutinize politicians, and where there is regulation about corruption. I think this is one of the very basic fundamentals, together with, of course, a free market. But the way we see to get today is in some way backwards. I agree very much on this. And therefore I think it's so important, with all good forces working together for more freedom, and also to offer opportunities, so people don't have to be frightened. And I would like to say that when I started in OSCE, I did hear a lot of people in former Soviet countries referring to it was better before, when we were a part of Soviet. Those people are not alive anymore longer, because they were quite old. And now there are younger generation. And they are talking about education, to go to Europe, to go to US, to go to Canada, to build a fortune, to build a life for themselves, for their family, for their friends. And they have ideas. And our duty is to try to support that those ideas can be alive. And I just want to underline the Eastern Partnership that was founded by Sweden, and when Mr. Carl Bildt was the foreign minister in Sweden, together with Poland, because it was a win-win agreement between some of the former Soviet countries, together with European Union. If they just developed their laws and regulations, they could also make trade with Europe, and it made income for the countries. So I think there needs to be something in the system as well, and the Eastern Partnership is one part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a short question for Mats and Nils. So where in Europe to find those good ideas? Where are the best places to look for good ideas for the future? Who would like to start, Nils or Mats? Mats warned for France and Germany, but there must be some better places perhaps to look for ideas.
I mean, let me try to start a little bit. I'm trying to tie on to what Margareta just said here. It's I think we need ideas, but ideas can basically be two things. It can be ideals and normative values and all kinds of things. Those are extremely important. But there are also worldviews about what works and what doesn't work. And we can convince others that don't share our ideals by explaining that central planning is a bad thing, centralization is a bad thing, competition is a good thing, while having these, global stars or whatever France and Germany wants is a bad idea. Having politicians trying to pick the winners, that's always a bad idea. So I think you can work with ideas in very different settings. I'm an academic, but also kind of policy entrepreneur, I guess, and we have some influence, especially when it comes to the worldviews, I would say. And there you need research, you need reports, you need these kinds of things, But you also need other actors that really work hard, to promote freedom and the individual integrity and tolerance and all this that I think you mentioned before, Margareta. We have there's a world out there, huge possibilities for people to work with ideas, and at least from my perspective, I think it's a lot more fun to work with ideas than just to earn money. There's no opposition here. You can do both, of course, but if you really want to live a good life, I would urge everyone to work with ideas, to promote things that are bigger than yourself. That's what the good life is about, actually.
Thanks,
Money is
Mats.
mean.
But engineering, that's both ideas and money, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, if you want to find countries that have a similar situation to the Swedish one, then we should join the other small countries, because the small countries, they are the ones that are getting squeezed by these giants that are if this agenda is really fulfilled, they are going to strike us out. If I'm a little bit abrupt here. So small industrial countries like, Finland, perhaps Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so there are very different institutional structures in these countries, of course, as well. But we have a common interest to try to fend off these big giants taking over the whole market, I think. And another issue, I don't think that the bureaucrats in Brussels, they are not the ones that are going to create ideas. They're like some species of shark. They have to swim, otherwise they drown. And swimming in this context is creating more legislation. So we're not going to see the creative ideas from the bureaucrats in Brussels.
Thanks. I think that was a good last remark from this discussion. Thank you very much, Margareta Cederfelt. Keep on fighting for democracy and fight against corrupt regimes. And thank you, Nils, for giving us those good ideas and helping young people to also find there's a good life working with good ideas. And thank you, Mats, for promoting Swedish industry and Swedish perspective. And we will definitely look into small countries in this format of Europe, this free market roadshow. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.